Hi class, I'm Juanita and today I want to talk about the Cold War and how it played out in Latin America. Although we tend to think about the Cold War being an ideological war between the US and the Soviet Union, and in many ways, yes, the Cold War was an ideological war between the US and the Soviet Union. The US was capitalist and believed in free trade, free market, and the Soviet Union was communist. Um, the Cold War was also a war for world dominance. Um, to begin with, World War II left two superpowers on world stage. The United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations have strong imperialistic ambitions. And one of the regions that was in the middle of the two hegemonic powers war for world dominance was Latin America. Um, Latin America, it's predominantly Spanish speaking, and it consists of North America, Central and South, and some islands in the Caribbean. In this video, I'm only gonna talk about how the Cold War reached and affected the country of Nicaragua, which is where I'm from, and Guatemala. Now, for a brief history. Although it is believed that prior to World War I, the U.S. has had isolationist policies, that is false. Back in 1827, U.S. President James Monroe dictated and signed what is called the Monroe Doctrine. Technically, the Monroe Doctrine warned European monarchies against intervening in the new independent nations of Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine also, in a way, formally set the stage for U.S. interventionist policies in Latin America. Or back in 1947, the Cold War is in full motion, and President Harry Truman initiates his policy of containment, also known as the Truman Doctrine. And its foreign policy was worldwide. And the purpose of the policy was to contain communism from spreading to other countries outside the Eastern Bloc. So as I mentioned, the first country we're going to be speaking about is Nicaragua. U.S. interventionist policies towards Nicaragua started as early as the 1950s. In the 1920s, anti-imperialistic and anti-U.S. imperialist leader Augusto Cesar Sandino was making headways in gaining popularity. He was against Navy intervention and the Navy being in Nicaragua. And this made the U.S. nervous because the biggest landowners of Central America was the United Fruit Company, an American corporation. Thus, the U.S. backed the regime of Anastasio Somoza. The dictatorship of Anastasio Somoza will rule Nicaragua for the next 40 years. It was until the 1960s that a group of rebels who called themselves the Sandinistas, they named themselves after the anti-U.S. interventionist Nicaraguan hero, campesino hero, Augusto Cesar Sandino, and they began to successfully protest the regime. The Somoza dictatorship was ousted in 1979 by armed struggle. They were ousted by the Sandinistas, ending a 40-year brutal dictatorship. Nonetheless, soon after the 1979 Sandinista Nicaraguan revolution, a civil war ensued between the Sandinistas, who were in many ways left-leaning, versus against the Contras, a counter-revolutionary group. And the Contras were backed by the United States. They were backed by the government of Ronald Reagan. Um, in the 80s, so that the Nicaragua encountered 10 years of a brutal civil war. And in the civil war ended in the 90s, in the early 90s, where there was a peace agreement between both groups, the Sandinistas and the Contras, and free elections were held, and Violeta Chamorro, a centrist moderate, was elected, bringing some sort of stability to the country after many years of armed struggle. As you can see, this is Daniel Ortega, who was also a Sandinista leader, and this is Oliver North, who some of you guys might have heard of the Iran-Contra affair, and he's the one that took the blame, and testified in Congress saying that Ronald Reagan didn't know about the U.S. selling arms to Iran and giving that funds to fund the Contras. Interesting history. So the next country that I mentioned that we're going to talk about is Guatemala. Similar to Nicaragua, Guatemala was also home to the United Fruit Company. In 1951, the second president of Guatemala to be elected, I should rephrase that, he was the second liberal, democratically elected president in Guatemala, was Jacobo Arbenz, and he popularized land reform, which granted property to landless peasants. Since the United Fruit Company was one of the biggest landowners of Guatemala, and the U.S. was afraid that Arbenz was too soft on communism. This is Jacobo Arbenz. And Jacobo Arbenz was also married to a Salvadorian socialist. So that made the U.S. very nervous as well. So they decided to take him out. Under President Dwight Eisenhower, the CIA armed, funded, and trained a force of 480 men, led by Carlos Castillo Armas. A coup was preceded by Armas, and the first invaded Guatemala on June 18, 1954, backed by a heavy campaign of psychological warfare. Arbenz briefly and unsuccessfully tried to arm civilians to resist the invasion, the coup, who he ended up resigning and exiling himself from Guatemala. 10 days later, Castillo Armas became president, and the country ensued 40 years of civil war, followed by lefty guerrillas that fought a U.S.-backed authoritarian regimes from brutal authoritarian regimes. One of these regimes even committed genocide against the Maya people of Guatemala. In conclusion, I briefly went over how the Cold War reached regions of Latin America. Even though I mentioned two countries, other notable mentions are the military junta coup d'etat of Chile in 1973. In an era where newly formed nations were decolonizing and finding the rule to govern, the two hegemonic powers, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, were trying to subject them to a neo-colonial rule. However, nations like Nicaragua and Guatemala, Chile, El Salvador found some agency in navigating the alliances between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Yes, many of the armed struggle were taken by leftist leaning group. They navigated the alliances between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and in a way they found some agency in navigating the alliances. And some of these aforementioned nations are still reeling from the economic, political, and social instability, and even prosperity, like Chile, um, that the medium of the Cold War brought. The When the U.S. perceived the Latin American democracies like Chile, too radical Chile, or the new Nicaraguan rule of the Sandinistas as too radical because they were left-leaning, it intervened militarily or encouraged their country's respective armed forces to stage a coup, with peaceful roads to reform forestalled. Latin American rebels felt they had little choice but to opt for armed struggle. And like I mentioned, many of these countries are still reeling from the effects of how both the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia, intervened. Um, and that's a little brief history of how the Cold War reached Latin America. And yes, thank you. Bye bye.